To start with, I'll ask my speakers for the day to take the table up there. As they do so, if you send me your AS number, I want you to take a moment to go to the mic. I've put them in some order, but I haven't seen the first. You as well. You should be the first one on the mic there. So introduce yourself. People get to know who you are, and yeah, we can peer with you. Okay, we'll take this information and push it forward to the peering forum mailing list so that people can know who was here and that they are looking for peers. So if that's okay with you all, I'll do that after this event. Next on, I'll invite Nishal to moderate this session to take us through the questions that have been sent to me in the course of today.
Okay, so we're in it for the home stretch. And Michuki's forgotten himself like he does very often. So there were some really interesting questions that came up from the discussion earlier today, and even from the discussion that we've had earlier in the week. And probably the most topical one, and the one that I think is going to want people talking the longest, and I'm sure we'll have some interesting viewpoints on it, is how do we build this concept of regional internet exchange points? And we've heard people say that they think this is a great idea. You've heard some people in class say that you think this is a bad idea. So I'm going to say, is this a good idea or is it a bad idea in your experience? And how do we go about doing this? The context of the question was, does connecting internet exchange points help bring better connectivity, cheaper connectivity to different areas in the region, and what's the long-term gain that we're going to get out of this? So before I start throwing this at anyone, do we want to volunteer? Yeah, Andrew, we'll start with you.
First of all, I have to say I think this question's got half the panel wanting to hide under the table. It's a very complicated question, and it's been something that's been discussed in South Africa quite heavily in the past. There are advantages to having a distributed internet exchange in the fact that people don't all have to congregate on a central location. If it's slightly distributed, they can use the places where they are closest to. However, there are some big complications. Someone has to pay for the infrastructure that connects the two sets of switches for the internet exchange. And again, that depends on the models that the internet exchange were originally built under as to how that's managed, how that's paid for. You've also got a situation where one internet exchange may be governed by one party and another internet exchange is governed by another party. So you're not sitting with one internet exchange that's actually just distributed. You're sitting with two different IXPs. When you start with two different IXPs, good luck on the politics. This has been discussed. How long have we been discussing this in South Africa, Nishal? Like 5-6 years at least, with no resolution. So whether or not this is a good idea, I'm not convinced at all, purely because I think you may be looking at more headache than it's worth. Rather take your own IXP and distribute it than try and merge it with another IXP or interconnect another IXP, but that's just my take on it.
Okay, so Andrew doesn't really have an answer for us. Let's move to Freddie.
In my opinion, it doesn't scale on the long term. So if let's assume you want to make an example, Johannesburg Exchange with Cape Town Exchange and interconnect them together. So probably you find someone who's willing to pay an interconnection link for 1 gig or maybe 10 gig, I don't know. But what when the link is full? Someone who has to take care of the cost. And there is also another technical aspect you have to consider. Spanning tree issues, VLAN issues, etc., etc. So, from my former life, as I used to be president of the SwissX Association. We've been discussing this, also interconnecting Geneva with Zurich, etc. SwissX spans through, I believe, 7 data centers across Greater Zurich area, and as long as all the switches are under one management, it's okay. But if you have two managements from two exchanges, then the trouble starts. So if you want to interconnect these two exchanges, then I would say do it via layer 3 and have a dedicated router which is exchanging the local routes from each exchange. But don't do it on a layer 2 basis.
Okay, so I guess the interesting area for this question is, for Africa mostly, is so how do we interconnect Uganda and Kenya? Or how do we interconnect Tanzania and the Jinx? I don't think there's that many countries that have multiple exchange points in the same country. If they do, it might be slightly easier to interconnect those, but the more interesting one is how do we interconnect two different countries? The points that have been raised already are quite strong. Economically, somebody has to bear that burden. And how do they recover that, particularly for members who are used to not paying for peering in some locations? However, even though a transit provider could interconnect Kenya and Johannesburg, there is no guarantees that either member at either exchange point would want to peer with the other. So then transit provider has a link that's almost virtually dead, because even though it's there, there's no interest from either side. So there'll probably be a whole marketing drive to get peering going, and that's where the complication begins to start. That's when the exchange points begin to get more complicated and so forth. So it's actually not as easy as it sounds, particularly for two different regions.
That's a comment from Mo.
Hi. So I've actually done this. We did this with LONAP, a rather failed experiment a few years ago. And basically for a lot of the reasons that have already been mentioned. If you start with commercial issues, there are some issues. An issue that hasn't been mentioned so far is that you're actually possibly competing with your members if you're an internet exchange and you build out infrastructure to reach out to another exchange. What if one of your members is already in the business of selling connectivity between those two cities? For instance, in Europe, it's very common that a large number of LONAP members, for instance, sell connectivity between London and Amsterdam. So if I then connected my internet exchange to another one in Amsterdam, I'm competing with it and potentially taking business away from them. That might make them upset. We're a not-for-profit, and I'd quite like to get voted in next time, so maybe I shouldn't annoy them too much. And then there's possible regulatory issues as well where you're going cross-border. I don't have much knowledge of that, but certainly Europe has fewer issues in that possibly than Africa, I suspect. Technical-wise, again, there are issues like what happens when the link becomes full. And Freddie's point about maybe connecting at layer 3 is a good idea and is being used by some exchanges in Europe right now. There's some longer distance interconnection going on. So overall, is it a good idea? Yes and no, really. I generally would like to avoid it, but sometimes I think you need to do things to stimulate the market in your areas, in your metros and in your cities, and interconnection is certainly one way of doing that.
Just a couple of words. Personally, I think it depends partly on how far away the two exchanges are within the same city or metro area. Maybe you could do it. You need to have an income stream to pay for the link between the two. So if they're free exchanges, it's not going to work. If the exchanges are further apart, like different cities in a country or different capitals in adjacent countries, I would much rather probably see people providing partial transit or some kind of link to reach the other exchange rather than trying to link the two exchanges together.
Okay, thank you. That's an overwhelming 5 of our experts that say that this isn't a good idea. Yet I have to wonder why we see so many proposals that come forth that say this is a good idea. And I think recently there's been a proposal in the local environment that says the exchange points should be interconnected.
Okay, so while he's coming up to the mic, so I mean, Ishas, the reason you're seeing a lot of interest from the governments and so forth is because ideally, on paper, it's a brilliant idea. But technically and commercially or policy-wise, the devil is in the details that we are saying aren't that quite easy to work out. I mean, Frank has raised some interesting points. In Malaysia, the government is pretty much funding the exchange point because they think, local traffic should be kept local, which is fine. But what they're doing also is locally within the country, they're creating additional exchange points where other folks should peer to get access. And the problem is that most of the ISPs tend to be in 3 major cities, but the exchange points are extending even to off the mainland. I think the reverse idea for that is to somehow allow the smaller ISPs to use the exchange point as a backbone, which, if you ask me, is a terrible idea. But they've asked me for transport. I'll not say no to the money. So it's those kinds of complications that really, in the details, it's a very difficult prospect.
Okay, so I'm going to tag another bit onto that question, and I'm going to say that I think the panel has been fairly consistent in their argument that this is not really a good idea. And governments now come out in some cases and said, this isn't working because the private sector, somebody mentioned competition, the private sector hasn't picked this up. How would you...
Came in was satellite-based. I sat in the team, I have to say, that had to evaluate the proposals that came in. I did not think it was a good idea then. But we had to award this to somebody anyway, so it was awarded to Frank, and probably Frank was not working there at the time, but and up to today, despite that, the fact that the 3 regulators actually awarded this tender to this project to an organization in East Africa to interconnect the 3 exchange points, up to today they have not done the project. So it's not that it expired, it's just that they never implemented it. Why? Because the economic side of it, they were unable to actually reach a point where they could see, or rather reach a point where they could actually be able to build a business model to support the interconnection of the 3 exchanges. So at that point, the projects, I would say, in my point of view, it actually stalled. Whether that has changed up to now, it's probably possible that it has changed, but maybe Frank is here and he could tell us more.
I think it's because bulk of the traffic today is Europe or US bound. That's where the money is going, unfortunately. Add to that, there's almost no difference in cost between Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania capacity versus Uganda, Kenya, US or UK capacity. So the incentive for operators is not there. However, there is a very good business opportunity here. And what me and Michuki discussed about last year was, this is a good opportunity. If somebody can make the numbers work, it's a good way to get this going. I don't think there's any other way interconnecting exchange points between these countries, or any other country for that matter, is going to work, apart from somebody taking a stance and saying, look, I'll do the business model, I'll make it work, and it will grow from there. I can't think of any other way that it would work.
This is slightly off topic, but it's an idea. A lot of people here are currently buying capacity from the likes of Seacom or Easy. And most of that capacity, irrespective of if you're in one of the inland countries or one of the countries on the coast, are all passing through a series of 3 landing stations. I do think that there is an opportunity to potentially approach the likes of Seacom and drop an IXP in the landing station. At that point, you could break the circuits in the landing station, interconnect those, and then take them on to London. So you'd actually have a break at the landing station. Everybody's circuits go through there. Yes, it's not ideal because you're still going all the way to the coast and back again on your circuits, but it stays on the African continent. Your latency will be lower. That is something that we're looking at for interconnecting African NRENs at the moment. Within the NREN community in Africa. So it's just a thought of something that could be possible.
Okay, so the last question that I want to ask around this is, we've heard conclusively that this is not such a good idea from the panel.